did not say a word when he did it. I simply set down my glass of sweet tea, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at my daughter across the table. She was smiling. That small, careful smile she had learned sometime in the past 2 years, the one that never quite reached her eyes. The one that said, "I am fine, please do not make this worse." I had seen that smile before. Not on my daughter, on women who sat across from me in a courtroom. My nephew stood in my living room and told what Matthews is that I spent 31 years as a family court judge in Forsyth County, North Carolina, and I have seen every shape a broken home can take. I have signed orders that moved children across state lines. I have held women's hands through testimony that should never have had to be spoken out loud. I know what a controlled woman looks like from the outside, the slightly lowered chin, the way her eyes track to her husband's face before she answers a question, any question, even something as simple as, "Do you want more bread?" My daughter Nora was 29 years old when she married Oliver. She had a master's degree in public health from UNC Chapel Hill. She had run a half marathon. She had once, at the age of 16, stood in front of our church and delivered a speech about civic responsibility that made 3 grown men cry. My daughter did not lack for confidence. She did not lack for intelligence. She did not lack for anything until she did. I want to tell you about the graduation dinner, but to tell you about that, I have to back up. I have to tell you about the summer she met him. Nora met Oliver at a conference in Raleigh. She called me that Friday night, still at the hotel, voice lit up the way it gets when she's excited about something, a little breathless, words tumbling over each other. She said he was funny. She said he was smart. She said he had driven 2 hours just to ask her to dinner after the conference ended. I said, "That's sweet, baby. What does he do?" She said he was in commercial real estate, based in Charlotte, doing well. I said, "How old?" She said 36. I said, "And he's never been married?" She laughed and said I sounded like her grandmother. I let it go. I am her mother, not her parole officer. She was 27 years old, and I had raised her to trust her own judgment. So I let it go. I met Oliver for the first time at Thanksgiving that year. He was handsome in the way that requires maintenance. Good haircut, good watch, the kind of shoes that cost more than they should. He shook my hand and said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I have heard so much about you. Nora talks about you constantly." He had a way of making you feel seen. A kind of focused attention that could feel, in the moment, like warmth. My son-in-law, my son-in-law at that point a year and a half later, had a sister named Claudette. Claudette was 3 years older than Oliver, also never married, also in Charlotte. She was thin and angular, and she spoke in a way that was technically polite but managed to insert a small correction into almost every sentence. She corrected Nora's pronunciation of a restaurant name at dinner once. She commented that the centerpiece Nora had arranged was country-looking in a way that might not photograph well. She said these things with a smile, the kind of smile that dares you to take offense. Oliver thought his sister was hilarious. The first thing I noticed, really noticed, the way a judge notices an inconsistency in testimony, was at Easter. Nora and Oliver had been married about 8 months. I drove up to Charlotte for the weekend, and we were all sitting on their back porch, iced coffees on the table, azaleas going absolutely wild in the yard. Oliver's phone rang, and he glanced at the screen and said, without looking up, "Ignore that." Nora's hand, which had been reaching for her own phone on the table, pulled back. She hadn't even looked at her phone yet. She didn't know whose call it was. But she pulled her hand back. I watched Oliver answer his call and walk inside. I watched my daughter pick up her glass instead. I said, "Who was calling you?" She said, "Oh, probably nothing. I'll check later." I said, "Nora." She said, "Mom, it's fine." It wasn't fine, but I didn't know yet how unfine it was. By that fall, I was noticing more. The way Nora would start a sentence and glance at Oliver before finishing it. The way she laughed a little too quickly at things that weren't funny, as if to signal to everyone at the table that we were all having a good time. The way she had stopped wearing the gold tube earrings she'd worn since college. I found out later Oliver didn't like them, said they looked cheap. She had started wearing her hair differently, too. Pulled back, more conservative. Oliver had mentioned once that he thought women in professional settings looked more credible with their hair up. Nora worked in public health outreach. She was not in a courtroom. She was not required to look credible in any way that required her to change her hair. I noticed all of this. I filed it away. And then came the dinner. Nora had been working for 3 years toward her doctorate. 3 years of late nights, of research, of a dissertation on maternal health disparities in rural counties that I knew. I knew as the certainty of someone who had spent decades watching people fight for what mattered was going to make a difference. She defended in March. She passed. She was Dr. Nora Whitfield Hale, and I was so proud of her I could barely breathe. Oliver suggested they host a dinner to celebrate. His idea, he said. He made the reservation himself. A nice steakhouse in uptown Charlotte, the kind of place with a pre-Huxfixie menu and a sommelier who speaks in a murmur. He invited his parents, his sister Claudette, my sister Ruth Ann and her husband, and me. I want you to understand what that dinner was supposed to be. It was supposed to be my daughter's moment. She had earned it the way you earn something real, with years of sacrifice and discipline and nights when she must have wondered if it was worth it. That dinner was supposed to be for her. We were 20 minutes in. The bride had come. Oliver had ordered a bottle of wine without asking anyone what they wanted. His father was talking about a property deal that had closed in Gastonia. Claudette was on her phone. Nora said something about her research, something about how she was already in conversation with the county health department about implementing some of her recommendations. Oliver laughed. Not a warm laugh, the kind of laugh that is a comment disguised as a laugh. He said, "Sweetheart, let's not bore everyone with the county health department." Nora's smile went careful. She said, "I just thought." He said, "You always think everyone is as interested in this stuff as you are." He picked up his wine glass. "It's a gift and a curse, baby." Claudette smiled at the table. My sister Ruth Ann looked at me. I did not react. I picked up my water glass, and I took a sip, and I looked at my daughter, who was now studying her bread plate as though it contained information she needed. Oliver turned to his father and resumed the conversation about Gastonia. And my daughter who had never once in 29 years needed anyone's permission to speak, sat quietly and did not say another word about her research for the rest of the meal. That was the moment I stopped filing things away and started doing something about them. I did not confront Oliver at the table. I did not make a scene. I did not pull Nora into the restroom and demand she tell me what was happening, because I already knew what was happening and a demand would have only sent her further inside herself. What I did was this. When the dessert came, I excused myself. I went to the restroom, which was down a long hallway with carpet thick enough to muffle footsteps, and I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a colleague of mine, a woman I had worked alongside for 15 years, someone who now ran the domestic violence legal clinic at a law school 2 hours away. I had referred cases to her for decades. She picked up on the second ring, and I told her I needed her to walk me through what documentation would be useful if we needed it later. Not for legal proceedings necessarily, just for clarity. For a record. She told me. I listened. I thanked her. The second call was to my financial advisor, because Oliver had suggested to Nora, gently, over many months, in the way you suggest something you intend to be non-negotiable, that it made more sense for them to consolidate their finances into a joint account that he managed, since he had more experience with investments and she was so busy with the doctorate. Nora had mentioned this to me in passing 6 months ago like it was a minor administrative decision. I had said nothing at the time because I wasn't sure yet. Now I was sure. I was in that restroom for 11 minutes. Then I went back to the table and I finished my creme brulee, and I told Oliver the restaurant had done a wonderful job with the event, and he nodded and said he always knew how to pick a place. What I am about to tell you, I want to be careful about, because the details matter. Over the next 3 months, I paid attention. I visited more frequently. Not in an obvious way, just a mother who wanted to see her daughter, who brought food and stayed for a few hours and watched. I started keeping notes in a small green notebook I kept in my purse. Nothing dramatic, just observations, dates, what I saw, what was said. I noticed that Nora's personal savings account, which I knew about because I had helped her set it up when she got her first real job, had been closed. She mentioned this casually. Oliver said the joint account earned better interest, and it was simpler. I said, "How much access do you have to the joint account?" She said, "I mean, it's both of ours." I said, "That's not what I asked." She looked at her hands. I noticed that when I called in the evenings, Nora would often answer and then say, after a few minutes, "Oh, Oliver just got home," and wrap up the call. Every time. Like a timer had gone off. Like his arrival was a signal that the call had to end. I noticed that she had stopped seeing her 2 closest friends from graduate school. When I asked about Maya, she said Maya was really busy. When I asked about her friend from Chapel Hill, who I'd known for years, she said they had grown apart. She said it in a way that told me she had been told they had grown apart. I noticed a yellow bruise on her upper arm in late September. She said she had bumped into the edge of a cabinet in the kitchen. I have been a judge for 31 years. I know when someone is telling me what happened, and I know when someone is telling me a story they have been rehearsed in. I wrote down the date. I wrote down what I saw. I kept the green notebook in my purse. In October, I drove to Charlotte and I asked Nora to have lunch with me, just the two of us. We went to a little café near her neighborhood that she had loved before. Exposed brick, good sandwiches, the kind of place that feels safe. We ordered. We talked about small things. And then I put my hand over hers and I said, I need to ask you something and I need you to know that no matter what you say, I am not going anywhere. She said, Mom. I said, I know you know what I'm going to ask. She was quiet for a long time. She looked out the window. And then, in a voice so small it didn't sound like her, she said, I don't know how to explain it. I said, You don't have to explain it. I just need to know that you can see it. She started crying, not dramatically, just tears coming down, the kind of crying that happens when something you've been holding for a very long time finally gets permission to come out. She told me about the allowance. Oliver had set it up as a budget. She had access to $250 a week, deposited from the joint account to a debit card he had created for her, for groceries, personal items, anything she needed during the day. He had explained it as responsible financial planning. He had made spreadsheets. He had made it sound rational. $250 a week. My daughter had a doctorate. She had a salary from her new position at the county health department. But that salary went into the joint account. And from the joint account, she received an allowance. She told me about the friends, how Oliver had mentioned early on that Maya had said something about him at a party, something disparaging. He wasn't sure if he should even tell her. He told her. It hadn't been true, almost certainly, but it had planted something. Then another comment, over months. A suggestion that her friend from Chapel Hill was jealous, that women like that couldn't stand to see their friends succeed. By the time Nora noticed she had stopped seeing both of them, it felt like her own choice. That is how it works. That is exactly how it works. I have seen it in depositions, and I have seen it in testimony, and I have now seen it in testimony, and I have now seen it in my own daughter's face across a cafe table, and I want you to understand that it does not announce itself. It does not come with a warning label. It comes with spreadsheets and reasonable explanations and a man who has a very good haircut and makes a reservation at a nice steakhouse to celebrate your graduation dinner. I held her hands across the table. I said, I'm going to help you. But we have to do this carefully. We have to do this right. She said, I'm scared of what he'll do. I said, I know. That's why we're going to be very prepared before we do anything. I called my colleague at the legal clinic the next morning. I drove to her office and I sat across from her with my green notebook and we went through everything. She gave me a list of attorneys in Mecklenburg County who handled exactly this kind of case. She explained what financial documentation would be needed. She explained the process. I hired the attorney myself. I paid the retainer from my own savings, which I had kept entirely separate from my daughter's situation and entirely unknown to Oliver. Over the next 6 weeks, very quietly and very carefully, we built a record. Nora opened a new account at a bank Oliver had no relationship with, and she began saving. Small amounts, nothing that would create a pattern in the joint account statements. Her attorney, the one I had hired for her, advised her on exactly how to do this in a way that was both legal and protected. I helped Nora photograph the documents she had access to, the joint account statements, the debit card statements that showed month after month what he considered an appropriate budget for a woman with a doctorate. We did not move fast. We moved correctly. In December, Nora moved out. She had a plan. She had documentation. She had legal representation. And she had a place to stay. With me. 2 hours south. For as long as she needed. She left on a Thursday morning while Oliver was in a meeting. She took what was hers and she left a letter from her attorney on the kitchen counter. I drove to Charlotte at 4 in the morning to help her load the car. We drove back before the sun came up, and I made coffee, and we sat at my kitchen table while it was still dark outside, and Nora cried for a long time. Not because she was sorry to leave, because she was grieving something she had thought was going to be her life. I did not tell her it would be okay right away. I just sat with her. Because sometimes the most important thing you can offer someone is simply the willingness to be present while they feel what they need to feel. Oliver called that evening. Then he called again. Then he called from a number I didn't recognize, which told me he already suspected his calls were being screened. I did not answer. Nora did not answer. Her attorney handled all contact from that point forward. He hired his own attorney. There were several months of proceedings. He contested things. He made arguments. He was, in the vocabulary of family court, not cooperative. But here's what Oliver had not accounted for. I had spent 31 years in that system. I knew its rhythms. I knew its requirements. I knew what documentation held weight and what didn't. And I knew that the record we had built, careful, dated, thorough, was exactly the kind of record that holds up. Claudette called me once. She said she thought I had poisoned Nora against her brother. She said she hoped I was proud of myself for destroying a marriage. I said, I am proud of my daughter. Then I ended the call. It has been 14 months since that Thursday morning. Nora's divorce was finalized in the spring. She has her own apartment now, back in Raleigh, near the work she is doing, the work that matters, the work she spent 3 years earning the right to do. She has had dinner with Maya twice in the last month. She called me after the second dinner, voice lit up the way it used to be, a little breathless, words tumbling over each other, telling me about the conversation they'd had, the things they'd caught up on, all the time they were getting back. She is wearing her gold hoop earrings again. I noticed the last time I saw her. I didn't say anything. Some things don't need to be said. What I want you to know, if you are listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you are watching someone you love become smaller than they are, if you are the one becoming smaller, is this the time to pay attention is not after the bruise. The time to pay attention is when the smile stops reaching the eyes, when the hand pulls back from the phone before it even knows why, when the words start requiring permission. That is when you start taking notes. And if you are the mother, the sister, the friend who sees it, do not wait to be asked. Do not wait for her to name it out loud before she is ready. Just stay close. Stay steady. Be the ground she can come back to when she is ready to come back. That is the only thing I know for certain that works. That and a very good attorney. What moment in this story stayed with you? And what city are you listening from? I read every single response, and I would love to hear from you. I still think about that green notebook sometimes. It sits in the top drawer of my nightstand now. I haven't opened it in months, and I hope I never need to again. But I keep it there, not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of what it costs to do the right thing slowly, carefully, and without flinching. What happened to Nora did not happen because Oliver was uniquely monstrous. It happened because he was methodical. He understood, the way certain people do, that if you move a person's boundaries 1 inch at a time, they will rarely notice until they are standing somewhere completely unrecognizable to themselves. The allowance didn't start at $250 a week. It started with a spreadsheet that looked responsible. The isolation didn't start with cutting off her friends. It started with a single planted doubt about Maya. That is how it works. Not a flood, a slow drip until the foundation softens. And what I have come to believe, after 31 years of sitting behind that bench, and now after living this, is that the people who survive that kind of erosion are not the ones who fight loudest in the moment. They are the ones who eventually find their way back to their own moral center, their own sense of what is right and what is wrong, independent of what they have been told by someone who needed them confused. Nora knew, somewhere underneath all of it, that being handed $250 a week by your own husband was not normal. She knew. She had just been talked out of trusting that knowledge. Getting her back to herself meant helping her trust it again. And that required something from me, too. It required me to be patient when every instinct I had was screaming to act. It required me to document when I wanted to confront. It required me to think clearly when I was frightened for my child in a way I have no adequate words for. I don't say that to suggest I was heroic. I say it because I think there is something in the discipline of that, the choosing of the long right path over the short, satisfying one, that is worth naming. Every phone call I made from that restroom was measured. Every entry in that notebook was dated and calm, not because I didn't feel the anger, but because I knew that anger alone would not protect her. What protected her was preparation. What freed her was evidence. What healed her is still healing her, because healing is not a destination, it is a direction, is the slow, deliberate work of reconnecting to who she was before someone decided she needed to be managed. She called me last week after dinner with Maya. She sounded like herself. Like the girl who called me from that hotel in Raleigh, breathless and lit up. I didn't say anything about it. I just listened and let her talk. That's all she needed from me in the end. Steady ground. I hope someone listening to this finds what they need too. The clarity to see it, the courage to name it, and the patience to do what is necessary to get free.